General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
Welcome to the Lead Pursuit Podcast, a podcast covering Blood Red Skies, a game of World War II aerial combat. So tonight's a little bit of a corrections episode. We talked a lot about airstrike during episode 14, but thankfully, the day that we were releasing that episode, a lot more information rolled in. Now, instead of holding the episode, canceling it, not releasing all that information, we decided to take what we were given, do a couple days of analysis, and post an intel update. Because, as we'll talk about, there's a lot of things we knew we were going to get wrong. Now, with our updated information, hopefully we can provide you listeners a better analysis of what airstrike is actually going to provide you. So tonight, I've got Brett on. Chris couldn't make it. Brett, it's great to have you again. Good to talk to you, brother.
Hey, happy to be here.
Yeah, so you've had a chance to go over some of these updated intel, as we'll call them. I think it's kind of funny. I always use the example, the real world example. I think we've all said in an intel brief where they roll out and go, well, here's what we know today. And you go, that wasn't what you told me yesterday. You're right, sir. We got it wrong. Damn it. Now we got the right info. So I think that's kind of our theme for this podcast. Don't you agree?
Hey, we're always adding stuff, right?
We are. And so thanks to Andy and the Warlord team and to a lot of the other people behind the scenes, as soon as they heard some of our comments, as soon as they heard some things we're talking about, they fed us a little bit more information. And they really gave us a good look at the things that we didn't necessarily understand. And so we'd worked off some outdated information, some incomplete information. And I think that what we have now is going to kind of answer some of those questions we still had that were hanging out there about how does the entire airstrike rules system work together with the rest of Blood Red Skies. What I'd like to say is from the things that we've seen out there, I think airstrike is going to be a huge addition to the Blood Red Skies series of rules. And I think people need to understand that it isn't so much just another pamphlet you're going to use, but Andy and the Warlord team have really tried to tie everything back together. And I won't call it a version 2.0 because it's not like they're making big changes to the rules, but they're really trying to make sure that airstrike works seamlessly with the rest of the Blood Red Skies rules and that everything all kind of flows together. Now, from the information that we've seen, the information has kind of been slid our way. It looks pretty impressive. I think that we'll be really happy with it. Hopefully everybody who's been a part of the Blood Red Skies Ready Room has seen some of these pre-release ideas. As Andy and the team have refined those ideas, they've really tightened up some of the wording, some of the language, trying to make it all flow well. What I will say is it's a product made by humans. You may find some typos. You may find some wording of some rules that are a little confusing to you. Guess what? It's a game. Deal with it. We've all been there. And Brett, I think you'd agree. There's things that we might have written differently, but seeing the information that they've sent us on some of the corrections and some of the rewording of the rules, it generally seems to make sense.
And comprehensive, I would say. That's kind of my big takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people need to understand this before we even have the discussion of what's new in airstrike, what's corrected from what we talked about last time, is if I was going to use an analogy, it's almost like when a lot of these games, and I'll use 40K maybe, when you transition from a lot of updates that are indexes and not necessarily a full new release of the rules, all of a sudden you're putting everything back into one big rule book. All the information is designed to play well together, and you get that first big rule book and codex drop, and you're not dealing off of old indexes and the previous edition rules and how they were interpreted. There's a lot of good information that's put in there. And so I think that's going to help all of us as we step off and have a rule set that supports dogfighting and ground attack. And obviously there's going to be some great scenarios in there. I'm really looking forward to see what makes the final cut, what scenarios are going to be in the final rule book. But from what I've seen, there's going to be some interesting, challenging scenarios, and they'll have plenty of background information to help you make the right choice about the aircraft that you need to put in there, the type of models you want to use, and the type of terrain. So let's talk a little bit about some of the questions that we know we need to correct. There was some misunderstanding about anti-aircraft fire and how it will work. And what I will say is that the light flak appears, and I'll say appears, to always be preemptive. In other words, it will always be able to shoot you down in all the attacks except for the high altitude attacks. The light flak won't be a player. But in your dive bomb attacks, in your torpedo attacks, in your strafing attacks, it's always a player. Along with that was the question of what do point hits really do? People had asked us, they said, if I'm out there strafing and I get a point hit on a vehicle column, what good does that do? It still takes area hits to destroy the column of vehicles. Well, we did confirm with our sources out there that each point hit will take away 1 die of light flak. So think of it as shooting up that flak wagon that's in the convoy or doing some other kind of damage is going to take away the effectiveness of that light flak. So that will help you out there. And then remember, once again, as we talked about for strafing attacks, they do have the capability to inflict hull damage on ships. A lot of argument on the internet about that over the last few weeks. But if you take a look at the amount of dice you're rolling versus the kind of targets you have, and realize most of the heavier ships also have the armored trait, that's going to start reducing dice and start taking away the capability of a strafing attack to be able to sink a ship through pure strafing. You had strafing ordnance in there, all bets are off. But once again, just through pure strafing, it's gonna reduce that number of dice. So once again, I would encourage people, when the rules do finally drop and when you get a chance to get your hands on the rule book, don't just take a first cursory look at it, play through it, see how the rules all work together. Because once again, it's a combination for targets, just like with aircraft. You've got target traits that play into how the effectiveness of that target plays in the game. But I think that brings up one of the interesting things we want to talk about, Brett, is there's a couple target sets out there, and there's a couple missions that might actually play well as solo missions, right?
Yeah, I think so. It's funny. The questions that I've seen people posting about what might be coming and the good ideas people have posted, strangely enough, I think, at least from what we've seen, have mostly been already addressed. I think people are going to be pretty pleased.
I think so. You know, what were some of the things in this last little bit of intel dump that we got from the Warlord team? What were some of the things that still surprised you, though, that were either written a certain way or rules, what we kind of felt were rules loopholes that hadn't been closed?
Nothing pops out of my head as being, there's a big vacuum. I didn't come away scratching my head wondering what was missing. I did see a question about kamikaze attacks that I haven't seen answered anywhere. If there's any, if there's any kind of mechanism for, coming up with a kamikaze attack. But is there something that you've seen out there that?
Well, I think there were two. There was the kamikaze / ram attack. Can you do that on ground targets? Can you choose to ram a ship and with that kamikaze attack, can you create what kind of attack do you create? And, then there was also a handful of questions about aircraft firepower traits. So if I'm making a strafing attack and I have an aircraft that's heavy hitter, does that heavy hitter trait count for the strafing? Or if I have buzzsaw, does that count for the strafing?
We did talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't see anywhere in the information that we were passed whether that was addressed or not, that firepower traits always apply. And I think there are probably similar questions for ace traits about maneuverability. If an ace is attacked, and some of the cards that you can play there, like slippery and some of these other traits, do those apply in a anti-flak role? So if you're defending against flak, can you use some of these other traits out there that might boost your maneuverability, might boost your ability to defend with any one of these attacks? So I think there's some things that may need to be FAQ'd, but I also think that there are also opportunities to draw the line between aerial combat and ground combat and say, no, we're not going to transfer traits from one to the other.
We're mentioning solo missions, and I just saw a post where Andy Chambers gave some very specific instructions for how to play a V1 shoot-down mission. And, it came up, I think, in a thread on the Blood Red Skies Ready Room where somebody was like, brought it up as a good idea. Like, hey, is there a way we can do this? And, several posts later, Andy chimes in and gave very specific, like, yeah, try it like this. And I thought that was really clever. And we may see that.
Right. I was kind of curious because seeing how they put out from a couple different guys that were talking about it. What kind of missions would you have to intercept a V1? What do you think? And really the whole argument of buzz bomb. Was it buzz bomb flipping? Was it buzz bomb shooting? What's the what's the best way to simulate that? And then a little bit of a discussion about, hey, maybe that's really a good way to introduce kind of some of the solo play thoughts. And Andy, of course, weighs in and says, hey, you really use scenario 0 again, the one that we've talked about, the most asymmetric scenario that's out there. Use scenario 0, and here's your rules for a flying bomb. So I think that's pretty cool thing that he's put out there. And obviously he's provided the actual information that he built to write that scenario down. So
yeah, I thought it was really cool because as people were asking, as this thread, I was reading a thread almost like a conversation, right? People were chiming in saying, hey, but what about this? And if you're too close and it explodes, well, then you're in trouble. So this long thread with all these points were brought up about, well, you got to make sure you do this and remember this. And, oh, what about this? And then when Andy chimes in, every single one of those things that were brought up in that conversation, if you will, were addressed in that brief rule set he gave. I thought that was really cool.
Which is always the funniest thing to me about the interaction between a game designer and the community. Sometimes, and we've seen some recent posters in the Ready Room take this attitude. They either assume Andy hasn't run across these situations before, or they want an immediate answer from Andy and an immediate rules dispensation. And Andy is very loath to jump in and chime in on those. But when, as I will say, excuse me, the good idea fairies start working, a lot of times he's actually done all the hard work. And as we saw, he rolled out this idea for a modification of scenario 0 that took into account all their concerns. So I think, to me, that really that tells you how long Andy has been fooling with the rules, how much he's done to it, how much he's played with it, how much he's really tried to bring that out as a coherent simulation as much as possible of World War II aerial combat.
We've been kind of joking around, offline about swordfish and gladiators and how you hate biplanes and stuff. But a similar conversation came up on the Ready Room just about the swordfish and some other things and some traits and stuff for the swordfish. And
right, so we'll talk about that in a separate episode. But I think there's an interesting discussion, and Andy and I are kind of the same opinion that the last thing I want to do is pollute my wonderful World War II aerial combat game with the traits of biplanes and how extremely slow torpedo aircraft would work. But that information is out there. So I think that in the next weeks, the community will just need to standardize a little bit of that, put some of that out there. And hopefully, if we have some time to help with that standardization, we can absolutely do that and get some of that information.
The only reason I even brought it up, though, is there was a similar thread, like that conversation about the V1 shoot down mission that they were talking about the raid on Toronto Harbor with the swordfish, and it was an unopposed swordfish mission. And it got me thinking. I think somebody even suggested in the thread, like, hey, that might be a pretty cool way, something like that, a fun way to exercise the new mechanics of airstrike in a solo mission, almost like an entry level way to kind of try it out, where your opponent, one person's playing the attacker and the defender is only executing the mechanisms for like barrages or flak or whatever might be in what you're trying to play with, and doing the target stuff. And it might be an easier kind of way to do it without complicating it with 6 additional planes on top of all that too. And I thought that wasn't a half bad idea.
I think it's a great idea, because I could write the subtitle, "Fly the Fairy Swordfish. Do you like kissing your sister?" We can say whatever we want about biplanes, but not on my podcast. No.
Right.
I think it'll be interesting. There's some things you can do in there. I tend to lean to the later era and the cooler airplanes.
Well, it doesn't have to be swordfish. It could be Malta-based, Maryland's or something, going over to take pictures of, I don't know, whatever. But there's probably all kinds of opportunities to do solo missions to work out some of these different mechanics.
Sure, absolutely.
It doesn't have to be 30 airplanes versus 30 airplanes plus airstrike, flak and barrages and all that stuff, probably.
And there's plenty of opportunity for you to kiss your sister, so go right ahead. Just don't include me in this. I want no part of it. No. Well, a number of other things have dropped, and we normally will take some time and do an intel update about those specifically. But along with talking about like the Swordfish and aircraft that will play into a lot of the airstrike kind of missions, there are a lot of aircraft that are going to drop here soon. We've already had some Russian aircraft drop. We'll talk to Chris next week about his take on those aircraft that are up for pre-order. Thankfully in Warlord resin now instead of in metal, so that'll be pretty impressive. But the frustration for us is it seems like the Italian aircraft have kind of slid off the end of the release schedule. So we've been talking to Ken and talking to Andy, and we may see some lead pursuit cards for the Italian aircraft to at least cover down on the fact that they may not be released in current time for working with Airstrike and some of the missions that we may look at. But I think it was good. We finally heard a confirmation on, a planned date for Airstrike is before Christmas. And we heard that by summer 2020, a new box game focusing on the Pacific was going to be out. So that sounded interesting to me. What'd you think of that, Brett?
I thought that was pretty cool. There was also some pretty specific mention of new aircraft coming. Again, mostly Pacific stuff, but maybe as many as 12 to 14 new aircraft coming. Yeah.
So there were a lot of aircraft that were on that list. And once again, if they've got the processes down for Warlord resin, and we know the cards are already in the hopper for a lot of these are aircraft they could pretty quickly put out there. I realize it breaks your heart that no resin 4-engine bombers made the list. Seems Warlord doesn't want to print a series of bookends for you. But at least we still have the AIM models out there for a lot of these 4-engine bombers.
Sounds like these new releases also don't include any of the World War II jets. Those are kind of later.
Right. So
coming but later.
Slid later. Well, and I remind all the listeners, the reason we ended up with the jet card as we did was not because Andy thought it was the right time to release it. It was because there needed to be a tie-in to Bolt Action Korea. So we really weren't to that release point in Blood Red Skies, but we needed the tie-in. So Andy released that tie-in via MiG Alley, and we're going to see that all that information rolled back up into this airstrike compilation of rules. So it's putting all that stuff in one spot. And from what Andy and the team have said, it's really an effort to get these smaller releases that came out to satisfy very specific requirements, either of tying into Korea or getting other aircraft cards out there and some of those traits and some of those ways of fighting the aircraft. You get those all out there and then kind of reconstitute this into a new series of rules under the Airstrike banner. So I think that'll be pretty interesting.
There were some very specific drops, some leaks about aircraft. One of those aircraft said the BF-109G this year was the quote, and Tempest and the Ju-88 next year, and all of these will come with named aces. So
right, and so the other interesting part with the Ju-88 is it has been out of availability, I guess is the word I want to use, for a while, and so people haven't been able to get the card, they haven't been able to get models. It will be interesting to see that drop, and I assume that like the new Russian releases will drop in Warlord resin. So that will be very interesting to see how they handle that. It'll be interesting to see the level of detail. I mean, we've talked on the podcast before that the current hard plastic releases, not the soft plastic starter style releases, but the hard plastic releases really have a great level of detail, and hopefully they will carry that over into the resin aircraft.
I wish I could get my hands on some of those Ju-88s right now. I've got a queue that I'd like to get started on with those, but I'll have to wait.
No, you just have a problem. You don't have a queue. A queue is what a worker does. You're an addict. There's a different term.
So, yeah, you're right.
Don't make it seem like you're producing something on commission here. This is purely for our own playing desires.
Nearly have all of the 109s and all the 110s. So now I just have to have all the 88s. So
excellent. Well, that's good. I've accomplished 0, and I'm sitting here on a work trip with still getting 0 done, other than getting the podcast recorded. So that's fine. When I get back from my overseas travels here in a little bit, I'll be able to turn to on the modeling again, which will be nice. But along those lines, we'll talk about it right now because we're talking about Airstrike. There's been a lot of discussion about what do you use for targets. There's references to, do I put the target card on the board? Do I put a marker on the board? Do I put just a counter on the board? What is out there to make a target? And part of the problem we run into is scale. Now you've heard me, have a philosophical discussion about what scale is Blood Red Skies really, and we can have that argument until the cows come home. But I think we all realize that the airplanes are much bigger than the scale of the game. So for a target, how big of a building do I put out there? If I put a 1/200 scale building, that factory is going to take up, a 8-inch square area. It's not going to be representative of the actual size of the target. And I think we saw that even with the new MiG Alley map release, because, right, we saw that North Korea map that came out from Deep Cut Studio.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, great map. And when you look at the Yalu is a trickle map because it's scaled properly. It's not the river's scale to the aircraft model is not a 1-to-1 ratio. So I think when we look at things like that, we go, well, so what do I buy? What type of terrain for targets do I buy? Well, I went out there and looked around from some guys I worked with years ago on a different war game. Worked with a company called Brigade Models and looked at their, of all things, their 2mm range, their Pico armor ranges. And then looked at the U.S. distributors who also had a lot more of their stuff and went out and found their small scale bridges, found out their small scale factories, ordered a bunch of that from their U.S. team and have started taking a look at that because it seems to be about the right scale. It seems
about
to
1
be
to 1200, right? 2
yeah,
millimeter.
it's 1 to 1200, and it's really good for identifying what the target is, but it isn't so big that it clobbers the map. You can still move multiple bombers around it, and if anyone needs kind of a frame of reference, it's almost like a Monopoly marker. It's something that you're really not going to interact with. It's just a tag to show where something is, and in this case, you put it on the map simply to be able to figure out, well, what's 6 inches for strafing, bombing, torpedoing, whatever. And I think we talked about ships are probably the same way. I'd love to have big, highly detailed ships, but that really won't help with the scale. Because if your ship is a foot long, now functionally the range of your torpedoes becomes 18 inches, because you're 6 inches from either end of this ship. So you need much smaller ships.
As we understand it, Airstrike's going to have punch out target cards that have the target information on them, and they're a set size, almost like a 3x5 index card almost.
Yeah, we don't know how big the cards are, and I think they're probably smaller than a 3x5 card, but larger than the 2.5 by 3.5 aircraft cards. They're probably somewhere in between. And so there's been some discussion, and even in the original rules drops that we saw on the Facebook group, there was discussion about putting that card on the board. And I'm not sure that's necessarily how we want to do it. Something I know you and I've talked about is really, do you take these Pico armor size targets and do you put them on a piece of acrylic, or do you put them on a card sleeve, something so you can see the beauty of the mat that you spend a lot of money on. So you can see those terrain features, but you now have this small bridge or this factory or whatever sitting on a card that's your reference that allows you to figure out what's 6 inches from that area.
I like that idea. I think use the card instead of actually putting the card. I mean, I see the relevant, the reason, the rationale behind putting the card on the table so that you can measure ranges and that kind of thing, right? But I like the idea of using that marker that you've come up with, a cool piece of terrain in a 1 to 1200 scale on top of a similarly sized acrylic or other, clear plastic thing that you could easily see the margins of, that's the same size as the target card. Put that on the map. Put the card off on the side, maybe where your squadron cards are, and treat it like you do, your bookkeeping for boom chits and stuff off on the side. And it doesn't clutter up your table, and you can still affect all those ranges and other necessities in the gameplay. But I just think it'll look cooler. That's an important part of this for me.
Well, and that is sadly the reason why I've gone down this Pico armor road, is not because I don't want to use the tools we're given in the Airstrike book, but because I sit there and I go, I want to bomb a bridge. I don't want to bomb a card.
Yeah. Well, and I bet the size is going to be nicely scaled, but big enough that you have some pretty cool detail. I bet they would paint up nicely and look pretty neat. I think you could have quite a nice collection of different assorted targets on your bookshelf or wherever
right.
playing.
And I think there's an ability to build larger ones if you're doing a larger scale kind of event where you need more aircraft to be within 6 inches, because that kind of is a consideration that if I'm doing a massed attack with 6 single engine bombers, as some of the scenarios call for, I can't have a 1 inch square target without everybody running over each other, getting in and out of the target area.
You really practically have to have that card. I mean, I totally get why they have the card. It makes perfect sense.
I'm just curious to see what the size is, because I guess coming from a 40K, 30K background, there's always baggage of how much extra range are you giving someone by making the card larger, and so are people going to be terrain modeling their cards for advantage and making them small if they're the defender?
Right.
If they're the attacker, do they show up with large cards? They slide up and go, oh, look, here's my card with my terrain on it. Isn't it cool? Yeah, no, I just gave you an extra inch in either direction to shoot. But along with that, there's some of the companies that have also released flak markers, which I think is pretty cool. Maybe it's because I'm an old Monopoly kid. Yeah, so they're small little flak cannons. Now you and I had gone back and forth about a couple other models that were out there, and there's some of the standard micro armor scale, the 1/285th or 1/300th scale micro armor flak weapons. And my comment on that was they tended to get a little bit big when you needed to put 4 flak points out there for an airfield or something like that. And I think some of these things we'll have to just play with and see, because maybe I'm totally missing it. And sure, on one of these cards, I can fit 2 hangars, a control tower, and 4 flak icons. 4 1/285th flak pieces. But not knowing that in my mind, I'm like, I kind of think they need to be smaller. And I went out there and I can't remember if it's Litco or one of the other companies. Has small little flak markers that you put out there so that you can put a number of flak cannons, so you can immediately look down and go, okay, there's 4 light flak on this target, and as target takes point hits and you pull those off, now you look down and go, oh, he's down to 2 light flak dice. So it gives you a really cool visual acrylic ready reference out there. I think those would be neat.
We've seen Litco and others make acrylic game aids, for the high cover markers and the boom chits and the activation things. Now you're going to see potentially, laden aircraft markers, barrage markers. Who knows? There's all kinds of opportunities out there for somebody to do something clever like that.
Yeah, and so me being, if there's nothing else, I'm a acrylic hoarder. It's a great opportunity to buy individual, burnout markers. So they've got like burned out vehicle style markers. You can drop those on each one of your target cards to track, your individual hits. There's a lot of cool things you can do if you collect acrylic like I do.
Because you're going to
put individual flak bursts out there when you're doing the barrage flak, which is in the rules obviously different than the light flak.
Because you'll be keeping track of your point hits and area hits on those target cards, much the same way we keep track of boom chits on the squadron cards, right? Yeah. So there'll be markers for that potentially.
And there's always ways you have markers. Maybe you use like a wound dial, like you would in 40K or 30K. So maybe you just have a wound dial that goes up to 5 or 6, and you just dial that down as you lose point hits, area hits, whatever. And there's always some cool opportunity. You can always make those wound dials with some neat background art in there. So, maybe somebody will do that for the community and offer those at a reasonable rate out there. But I think there's certainly some opportunities. And then as the rules have added more things that end up on the board, there's a requirement for different kinds of markers, because, there's not just barrage flak out there that would normally affect only neutral or advantaged airplanes. There's splash flak, where they're shooting intentionally low enough to throw up water in front of low altitude attackers. So there's a need for splash markers out there that would be shot at disadvantaged torpedo bombers. So it's really interesting, all the different combinations of things you could have out there.
Super cool. I'm always kind of impressed and intrigued in a way, the cool things that come out like that. I think it's really neat to see the good ideas people come up with and the things that come out. I'm always kind of a sucker for those kind of things, they may be, I think about it like from 40K and stuff, all the different little gadgets and special dice or whatever. I just think that stuff's all super cool.
Yeah, I think it'll be neat. I think the only concern I have, we always never see the final version of the rules, so we'll see how it actually rolls out there, is that there are still, at least in the interim versions we were looking at, some items that are out of place. And so you sit there and you go, why do I not find about, splash barrages until I got all the way to the end of the torpedo discussion? Actually, I think it's even later than that. I think we ended up finding it in the information we had. It was almost all the way into the scenarios. And so there's some things that you really will have to read the entire rule book to find all the cool things you can do in Airstrike. But I think it certainly, without being too fanboy about it, I don't think there's any reason a current boxed game player wouldn't want to go pick it up. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Brett?
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to get it and play with it. But the one thing I was most impressed by, I was kind of expecting it was just going to be this separate, almost like an expansion kit or something. It just had these extra rules if you wanted to strike ground targets, but it doesn't really come across to me that way. It comes across to me like a wholly new, like, hey, look, this is everything. You want to play this game and you want to go suit the nuts? Here you go. Here's everything you need to do this thing. So it really
the way takes the stuff that we saw was written really seemed different than the Airstrike only drops that we had on the Blood Red Skies Ready Room. So really, like I said, it really seemed like a holistic, we're going to reference all of the other capabilities in the rest of the book, and that you're not referencing your expanded rules, your basic rules, and your Airstrike rules. That if you buy Airstrike, you'll have an ability to have all this information in one spot, hopefully with some improved diagrams. I always use the example that from what we've seen, the best description is like going from a 40K box set where you've got this little small, maybe 5x7 pamphlet of the rules that covers the basic 7th or 8th edition 40K rules, to now going up and picking up the hardback rules book, because that hardback rules book has fluff. It has really good explanations of the rules with diagrams. It has a lot of special information in there that you can use for campaigns or for changing up how the game works, because there were some cool new things that we saw in the rules drop that we were shown. And so it's one of those things that there really isn't a reason why you wouldn't want to go pick it up, unless you just are being a curmudgeon and like playing with your scenario book and basic and expanded rules.
It's very comprehensive. I mean, it's got you'd have everything you need to play pretty much every level of the game, from the very basic stuff and
right. And I liked how there were some new options in there, because at least one of the things that we saw that was not anywhere in the original Airstrike rules that we looked at was the variations on how to manage your action card deck and the ability to have an open play deck where everything is just face up, and you take cards out of them, you plug them in there, you put them in there, you flip them over if they're dead until the end of the turn. New turn comes, you flip cards back over, and it was a new way of playing it, realizing that you weren't so worried about the randomization. You were worried about the tactics of choosing the right card to play at the right time. So
it was pretty neat. There's a lot of there's a handful of optional rules in there for different things that people get embittered about or whatever. And I thought it was cool to see that they're, oh, hey, look, try it this way and see what you think.
Yeah, and we say it a lot, we joke about it, but there's a lot of different house rules you can put in there. I was happy to see that there were some of those house rules kind of addressed. That, hey, try it this way if you like it. If you don't like it, do this. And even in some of the scenarios, there's been an addition to the rules. I think there's still a lot of room in there, and I don't mean to say it as a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot of room for tweaking. And at the end of the day, it's what do you want out of the game? Do you want something that is super detailed, lots of aircraft, super tactical, or do you want something that's quick and easy and fun to play? And now I think the Airstrike rules not only gives us the air to ground piece of that, but it says for the rest of the game, here's some things you can do. Here's some ways you can play your theater cards. Here's some more information, maybe some counterbalances to some cards that might have felt like they were a little overplayed in the early versions of the game. But certainly a lot more narrative flexibility. Is that the word we want to use?
Yeah. That was something I really picked up on the scenario portion. Of course, we talked about this the last time, how it wasn't just strictly air to ground scenarios. It's everything from mission 0 to now mission 11. So there's some variety in there. Not all of them are airstrike specific missions, but there was a flow I noticed that I thought was pretty clever in that the mission was each as you read each mission, it seemed like, I don't have them in front of me, so forgive me for being very vague here, but there was a kind of a brief description of how you could play this mission. It was very generic, if you will, like you could apply it to pretty much anything. It didn't give a whole lot of specifics. And then it would have maybe a tweaked version, like, you know what? And if you want to do something really different, try this option. And then it would then it would conclude with, okay, and then here's the final thing. Try this. Here's a narrative mission using this mission type, but use these aircraft that represent this squadron for this particular action that occurred on this date. And here's the background, or the little historical background about how this happened and how it's relevant. Now you can play this scenario using this number of aircraft and these victory conditions. It was essentially the same rule, but it was, the same mission, but they made a historical application of it. I thought it was really cool.
I think for me, the scenarios gave me scenario OCD. That there were so many choices and so many cool things presented. I almost stepped back and like, wait, what scenario number are we on again?
Right. I didn't expect that, because everything I'd seen before was just sort of the more generic, open-ended.
Very generic, very open-ended, not a whole lot of specifics given. But and I think there's a place for that, because you want to give people a rough framework to play in. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with saying, here's the historical prescription for how you would play this scenario in this one event. And I think that's pretty neat. I think that actually helps people who may not want to try to figure out the balance themselves and just go, I just want to play something cool with a suggested force listing, even if I have to proxy it.
I like that baby bird technique, especially if it's, recounting a specific, historical thing. I think that's kind of neat. Yeah.
I think that will work well. So what else did you see in the airstrike revision that we were looking at that really surprised you or interested you, or you thought the community would really be fascinated to hear about?
Man, I'm not sure how much I could say, but
we've probably already said too much. Sorry, Andy, but sorry, Warlord Games, you can kill us now.
Well, I was reading through and I was seeing, stuff about. I can't remember what the reference. Oh, maybe it was in the scenarios. I was seeing in the very specific historical scenarios references. So like, okay, you're going to have, this ace, and he's going to have this trait, and these are all ace cards that they're mentioning that I should have from my Luftwaffe expansion. I was like, what the heck is this? I never heard of this.
That's going to be interesting. I wonder how they're going to solve that problem. Hint, hint. And we'll talk no more about that.
Okay, good. Curb my enthusiasm.
It's a great point to bring up. So I think this is another reason why trying not to be too fanboy about it. If things proceed the way that at least we've been led to believe, I'll say it that way, on the lead pursuit side, if things proceed the way they are, this really is a all-encompassing rules piece. And at the end of it, you'll sit there and you'll have a lot more ready references for playing a variety of theaters, a variety of aircraft, a variety of aces, a variety of things. You'll have a lot more information. For people that are 40K players, if they remember, and I get my editions wrong here, I want to say it was at the end of 6th edition, how you could flip to the back of the book and you had a lot of information there that even if you didn't have the codexes, it kind of got you started. I'd say expect that, but more. So I think Airstrike is going to be a good initial purchase for somebody who maybe wants to buy specific models and doesn't need a Battle of Britain starter set. Or it'll also be a good way for those of us that have played for a while to really recage ourselves to all the rules put together in one spot. Okay, I know that we had a number of questions from listeners, and we tried to hit at least most of the ones that covered Airstrike. Covered some of the upcoming releases. Brett, what were some of the other questions, other suggestions from our listener?
Yeah, we got a great suggestion from Michael David Ivancic, and forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, but Michael gave us a suggestion right on our Lead Pursuit podcast Facebook page saying, "Hey, you guys mentioned some products out there, but it's hard to know where to go, and it's frustrating to rewind the podcast to find the names of what you talked about." He asked us if we could add a show note after every episode with any links to any products we talk about. And I think we might have done something one step better. On our Facebook page, we've created an announcement or maybe that's not the right terminology, but there's a post at the top. It remains at the top of our post feed on the podcast page that has a list of all the links for any product that we discuss or review. And I add to that every episode. If we talk about something, I'll add to it. Just know that if you go and check that out, if you just look at it briefly, it may look unchanged. You got to click on the little tab that says see more to see it expanded and see what we've added at the bottom of that post, from podcast to podcast, from episode to episode. You'll see that expand as we add more products, and there are links so that you can go to their websites, check them out. And we appreciate that suggestion, Michael, because I think that's a real handy thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Thank you for pointing out that I'm a terrible podcast host. We already knew that, but that's all right. No, thanks for reminding us to put that information out there, because once again, there's a lot of links that we come across that we dig through that absolutely it's easy for us to put on the episode, put on the head of the header for the entire Facebook page. That way people can reference it and not have to dig back through the audio and try to figure out with my broken Southern English where we're actually, what the web addresses for these places are and where they are in the interwebs. Awesome. Well, I think that's most of what we have for today. We're trying to keep it fairly short, keep it tight to the Airstrike release, to correcting a couple of things we'd looked at, and to kind of describing the scope of this latest preview that we had. Any last minute comments you want to add, Brett? Anything you want to throw to the listeners?
I'm just busy plugging away. I'm super excited. I think reading what I've seen on Airstrike is making me even more super geeked out about the Malta thing that we're working on. I hope to be able to run a lot of those missions and scenarios with the aircraft I'm busily painting.
Well, good. If you're geeked out about Malta, go out there to Pico Armor and you can find Malta fortresses, Malta houses, Malta airfields. So if anybody who wants to play along with Malta scenarios, once those start dropping, feel free to support the boys over at Brigade Models or Pico Armor in the U.S. and take a look at that. And likewise, please simply take some time, give us some feedback, either on Facebook, on our Facebook page, going to our website, leadpursuit.net, going on there and writing a comment, or just dropping us a line on Instagram or inside the Facebook group for the Blood Red Skies Ready Room. We're in there all the time. We pay attention to what's being said, and we try to help Ken and the guys that admin that page to kind of pull out some of the best ideas from the community there and make sure that action is taken on those and that they're turned into something that's usable by the team. Well, thanks for joining us tonight. Brett, it's always good to talk to you. Hopefully we'll get back with Chris next week and talk about some of the other releases that are near and dear to as a Russian player. And then we'll start exploring some of the latest changes that we've put out there, things that we're going to try to explore through the Airstrike rules, through the Malta scenarios, and some interesting historical situations that we have.